A massive, ancient city stands as the last bastion of a dying civilization. Its legendary walls have held for centuries. Now, an overwhelming army surrounds it on all sides, dragging forward weapons of unimaginable destruction. The defenders are outnumbered, outgunned, and they know that if this city falls, an entire age of the world dies with it. I'm talking about the fall of Constantinople in 1453, but I could just as easily be describing the siege of Minas Tirith in The Lord of the Rings. The parallels between these two sieges are so striking, so eerily similar, that once you see them, you will never watch The Return of the King the same way again. And here's the kicker. Reality had Greek fire, so today we're going to break down one of the greatest fantasy battles ever written against one of the most consequential real sieges in human history, and I think you'll agree with me that the truth might actually be more dramatic than the fiction. Let's set the stage. Minas Tirith, the White City, capital of Gondor. Built into the side of a mountain with 7 tiered levels of stone, it is the greatest fortress of men in Middle-earth. By the time of the War of the Ring, Gondor is a shadow of its former glory. Its population has dwindled, its throne sits empty, its armies are scattered. But it remains the last real barrier between Sauron's forces and the total domination of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Now let's talk about Constantinople. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome itself, had been crumbling for centuries. At its height, Constantinople was the largest, wealthiest city in the Christian world. But by the mid-15th century, the empire had been reduced to essentially the city itself and a few scraps of territory. Emperor Constantine XI ruled over a population that had shrunk from hundreds of thousands to maybe 50,000 people. The city that once commanded an empire now stood virtually alone, surrounded by the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire under the young and ferociously ambitious Sultan Mehmed II. Both cities were the last jewels of fading civilizations. Both were defended by men who understood, on some deep and terrible level, that they were making a final stand, and both faced enemies who brought not just overwhelming numbers, but terrifying new instruments of destruction. Let's talk about the defenses, because this is where the parallels get really interesting. Minas Tirith's outer wall, the Ramus Ikor, enclosed the Pelennor fields, and the city itself featured the massive first-level wall made of the same black stone as Orthanc, supposedly unbreakable by conventional means. Tolkien describes it as virtually impervious to assault. The city's tiered design meant that even if one level fell, defenders could retreat upward, fighting level by level. Constantinople's Theodosian walls make Minas Tirith's defenses look modest. Built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, this was arguably the most sophisticated defensive fortification in the medieval world. We're talking about a triple line of walls. First, a 60-foot-wide moat. Behind that, a low outer wall. Behind that, a taller inner wall, rising 40 feet high, studded with towers every 60 yards or so. For 1,000 years, these walls had repelled every army that came against them. Arabs, Bulgars, Rus Vikings, Crusaders who only got in through treachery. No foreign army had ever breached the Theodosian walls by direct assault. They were the most proven military fortification in history. So in both cases, you have defenders putting their faith in walls that have legendary, almost mythical reputations. Walls that have never fallen. And in both cases, the enemy brings something that changes the equation entirely. In The Return of the King, Sauron's forces assault Minas Tirith with catapults, siege towers, and flying Nazgul. But the signature weapon is Grond, the great battering ram, 100 feet long, shaped like a wolf's head, swung by mountain trolls and imbued with dark sorcery. It is built for one purpose, to break the unbreakable gate of Minas Tirith. And it does. When Grond strikes that gate and the Witch King rides through, it is one of the most chilling moments in the entire trilogy. The thing that was never supposed to happen, happens. Now here is where reality genuinely outdoes fantasy. Sultan Mehmed commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orbán to build him a cannon. Not just any cannon. This was the Great Bombard, a bronze monster over 27 feet long that could fire stone balls weighing around 600 pounds over a mile. It took 60 oxen and 200 men just to move the thing. It could only fire about 7 times a day because it needed hours to cool between shots. But when those balls hit the Theodosian walls, walls that had stood for 1,000 years, they began to crack and crumble. The Ottomans also deployed dozens of smaller cannons, creating a bombardment the likes of which the world had literally never seen. This was the debut of gunpowder siege warfare on a massive scale. The defenders were witnessing the birth of a new era of war, and they were on the wrong side of it. And then there was Greek fire. The Byzantines possessed the formula for this legendary incendiary weapon, a substance that burned on water and could not be easily extinguished. They used it from their remaining ships to devastating effect against the Ottoman navy in the Golden Horn. Imagine liquid fire streaming across the water, turning ships into infernos. This is one detail where reality has absolutely no equivalent in Tolkien. Greek fire was real, it was terrifying, and it was one of the few advantages the defenders had. Yet even Greek fire couldn't save them. Let's talk about the people inside those walls, because this is where both stories become genuinely heartbreaking. Denethor, the steward of Gondor, has fallen into despair. He has looked into the Palantir, seen the scale of Sauron's forces, and concluded that resistance is futile. He descends into madness, abandoning his duty, and ultimately tries to burn himself and his wounded son Faramir alive. The actual defense falls to Gandalf, who rallies the soldiers and holds the city together through sheer force of will. In Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI was no Denethor. He was, by most historical accounts, genuinely heroic. He knew the city was doomed. He had appealed to Western Europe for help and received almost nothing. A few hundred Venetian and Genoese volunteers arrived, most notably a Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, who brought about 700 professional soldiers and took command of the land wall defences. Against them stood an Ottoman army estimated at 60 to 80,000, possibly more. The defenders numbered perhaps 7 to 8,000 fighting men total, trying to hold over 12 miles of walls. Constantine reportedly told his people that he would rather die than surrender the city. And he meant it. Both sieges feature a pitifully small garrison facing an apocalyptic horde. Both feature leadership crises among the defenders. And both feature a handful of extraordinary individuals whose courage keeps the defense alive far longer than anyone thought possible. In Tolkien's version, Minas Tirith is saved. The Rohirrim arrive at dawn, charging into the flank of Sauron's army in one of the most glorious cavalry charges in all of literature. Then Aragorn arrives with the army of the dead, sweeping the corsairs from the river and turning the tide completely. It's eucatastrophe, Tolkien's own term for the sudden joyous turn in a story that pierces you with a joy that brings tears. Constantinople got no Rohirrim, no Aragorn, no eagles. On May 29, 1453, after nearly 2 months of bombardment, the Ottomans launched their final assault in the early hours before dawn. Wave after wave hit the walls. Giustiniani, the brilliant Genoese commander, was wounded and carried from the walls, and his withdrawal caused panic among the defenders. Ottoman soldiers found a small gate, the Kirka Porta, that had been left open or inadequately sealed, and poured through. Emperor Constantine XI reportedly threw off his imperial regalia so he would not be captured and charged into the oncoming Ottoman soldiers. His body was never conclusively identified. The last Roman emperor died anonymous and defiant, swallowed by the tide of history. The city fell. The Byzantine Empire, the last living continuation of Rome, a civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years, ended in a single morning. Tolkien was a medieval scholar. He was steeped in the history of fallen civilizations, last stands, and the death of old worlds. While he never explicitly said Constantinople inspired Minas Tirith, the thematic DNA is unmistakable. The fading empire, the great city reduced to a relic, the walls that were never supposed to fall, the overwhelming enemy from the east, the desperate plea for allies who arrived too late, or in Gondor's case, just barely in time. Tolkien gave us the version where the cavalry arrives. History gave us the version where it doesn't. And maybe that's why both stories resonate so deeply. Tolkien understood that the power of the eucatastrophe, the rescue, the salvation, only works because we know in our bones that it usually doesn't happen. He had lived through World War I. He knew what it meant when the cavalry didn't come. The siege of Gondor moves us because somewhere in its bones lives the echo of every real city that stood alone and fell. If this video made you see either of these sieges in a new light, smash that like button. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Subscribe if you want more videos exploring where history and epic storytelling collide, because trust me, we are just getting started. And drop a comment below telling me which siege you think was more dramatic, Tolkien's version or the real thing. I read every single comment and I would love to hear your take. Until next time.